Right, okay, I think we'll get cracking on. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on when is a SOC not a SOC. My name's Paul Nee. I'm the Deputy Director of Sector Security at Jisc, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Mark Worthington, who's the Security Centre Operations Manager, and Steve Howard, who is the Head of Product for Cyber. Just a general kind of housekeeping. Please make sure, and as has already been posted in the chat, if you can use the Q&A for any questions you've got, we will try to answer them as we move along in the chat, but also we'll cover questions towards the end. So essentially, today's session is really designed to kind of cut through some of the jargon, some of the confusing elements around assessing, identifying, procuring a SOC solution. There are lots of SOCs and lots of services and providers on the market, and some of the insights that we've gathered from developing our own SOC service around the important elements and the elements that you really need to be thinking about when procuring such a solution. So agenda for today, we're broadly going to touch on the threat landscape, both at a high level, what we're seeing in both the education, research, and public sector, and what incidents and common themes we're seeing. We'll also talk a bit about alerts v action, so broadly looking at response as well as alerting and what those key elements make up within a SOC service and why essentially response is so important as part of a SOC service. We'll also cover why identity threat detection and response matters. We're seeing a huge increase in identity-based attacks across both internationally and nationally. And then finally, we'll cover some key questions and elements that you should be asking when you're looking at reviewing SOC providers and whether or not certain aspects, for example, when the worst happens, whether or not they're covered and included broadly as part of the service. So, briefly touching on kind of high level threat landscape, the evolving threat landscape, it is continuously evolving. That's a key piece. What we're seeing a lot of escalations from sophisticated threat actors, so more advanced and target and persistent threats, and including state-aligned or state-backed targeting. But also what we're continuing to see is the more criminal activity, double extortion, ransomware still remains the leading threat nationally and internationally in every sector of the economy. But what we're also seeing in terms of that evolving threat landscape is that threat actors are also increasingly prioritizing the data theft element of ransomware. So what we're also seeing now is not necessarily with the double extortion encryption of systems that does still happen, but also we're seeing much more weight and much more prioritization around the theft of that data, that important personal identifiable information, and data that either can be used to extort organizations, and if organizations don't pay ransoms, then that data can be onward sold to other threat actors with onward attacks, such as phishing and other financially motivated attacks. Now, while the growing use of AI is becoming a really big problem, it's not yet created any fundamentally new attack vectors directly in terms of tactics and techniques. But what it has done is it significantly lowered the barrier to entry and enabling less sophisticated threat actors to conduct attacks with greater effectiveness and scale. So, the problem is broader in that regard. We are seeing obviously continuous issues around vulnerabilities, new vulnerabilities being identified on a daily basis. Obviously, again, mentioning AI, the increased use of AI and in particular Mythos being mentioned recently is kind of a step change in approach to vulnerability management, and certainly from a vendor perspective, understanding and identifying vulnerabilities within their software code and being able to patch that software, release patches is becoming ever more important. We are seeing seeing a ever increasing amount of vulnerabilities being identified on public facing systems, and then threat actors very rapidly going into exploitation mode and developing exploits for those public facing systems. So having an understanding of what your kind of external attack surface looks like is a real, critical piece of the puzzle. And the risk and the operational impact of cyber attacks. We mentioned ransomware, but obviously there are others, but they are increasingly growing in terms of their operational disruption to both teaching, learning, research, and core institution and core public sector organization facilities and functionality across that whole piece. Hugely damaging, hugely impactful if they're not detected and responded to at an early stage of the attack. And as I mentioned earlier, identity-based attacks are on the rise. We're seeing a huge increase in identity-centric intrusions, both in terms of kind of the lower level initial intrusions from things like password spraying, brute force, business email compromise, phishing, all of those key elements, to then onward identity compromise once threat actors are within the infrastructure. So whether or not that's on-premise infrastructure or whether or not that's cloud infrastructure, threat actors are trying to move laterally, compromise more accounts, and get to their kind of end goals of gaining access to, for example, administrative accounts or systems, as I mentioned earlier on, that contain business critical data, so that they can essentially steal that data and ransomware you for it. So going into the kind of lower level details around the kind of common themes that we're seeing in terms of the threat landscape. So we still see social engineering, phishing, click fix, business email compromise. All of these things are really key drivers for that initial access vector and continue to be problematic. We see a lot of scenarios where threat actors are gaining access to systems through accounts, then doing onward phishing, or selling those access details on the dark web for other threat actor groups, to then pick up those credentials and then perform further compromise. We're seeing a continued use of info stealing malware. We see a number of info stealing malware detections within our SOC, but also from members and sectors that in particular use BYOD within their sector are an increased risk, because you may not have the same level of protections on your corporate-owned devices as you would on your BYOD devices as you would on your corporate-owned devices. Access brokers are a key part of the cog, the wheels of criminal gangs and threat actors. And as I say, compromised credentials, they're a big market continuing to be sold on the dark web. We have seen a kind of drop in those numbers more broadly, but it's still definitely a prevalent threat. What we have obviously seen is an increase as well in compromised public-facing vulnerabilities, as I mentioned earlier on. So threat actors are identifying systems that are publicly exposed, identifying vulnerabilities, either exploiting 0 days to get a foothold within the organization, and then they can laterally move from there into other systems. So having those early detections, but also those responses to those detections, is really, really key. As we see more workloads moving into cloud-based services like AWS, Azure, and Google, what we're now finding is attacks are much more frequently targeting cloud infrastructure. Cloud infrastructures are publicly exposed. They rely very heavily on identity and zero trust within their configurations, but they require a lot of work out of the box to make sure that they are configured correctly. And what we're seeing a lot more now is a term called indicators of misconfiguration, which is broadly what most of the vulnerabilities that we see within cloud infrastructure. It's broadly configurations that have either been deployed insecurely or configuration features and tools that haven't been turned on correctly. And then server and endpoint protection. So what we're finding a lot more in terms, especially in ransomware attacks, threat actors increasing their sophistication. We're seeing much more EDR, endpoint detect and response bypass. Although EDR tools are a really effective detection and response mechanism, and if you read any of the recent publications from SANS. I think it's somewhere around the 80% mark is where you see the initial triggers within a SOC, is within EDR for those initial indicators of compromise. But threat actors are understanding how to bypass them, and there's a number of bypass techniques that are out there. So going back to that defense in depth approach, not just relying on a single security tool, although EDR is a really important part of your toolbox, you do need to complement that with others. And we see the same shift in terms of multi-factor authentication as well, though multi-factor is becoming much more prevalent in the education, research, and public sector, which is great. Threat actors are finding the gaps in those multi-factor authentication deployments, but also they are finding ways of bypassing multi-factor authentication controls. So again, it's that evolution, that next step of making sure MFA is secured. The same thing with EDR, making sure that your EDR tools are correctly configured, they can detect the right things, that you're able to respond to those detections in a timely manner is essential. Lack of monitoring and response, which is a key element of really this presentation more broadly, which is you might have those detections there, you might not, but if people are not responding to them appropriately and containing the threat, then the threat actor will continue within the infrastructure. And you may then not see the threat actors activity if, for example, they've managed to bypass EDR. And as we mentioned earlier on, lack of identity protection is a really key one. And the NCSE have really highlighted this in recent webinars and recent publications around identity protection, and having that visibility of identity threats is really critical. So moving into the which SOC is right and what SOC for your organization. So just to emphasize, there's a huge number of solutions on the market. There's a lot of confusing language and inconsistent naming features, and a lot of lack of clarity around how each solution works. So it's difficult to choose based on your needs. So a lot of this presentation is really around trying to make sure that you understand some of the key components that you need to make sure that you include as part of that process of evaluating your SOC, and make sure that you're getting that clear end-to-end support from any SOC provider. So one of the key things that we see that is slightly confusing for people in comparisons is this concept of without response, you're only doing half the job. So a lot of SOCs that might just send alert notifications, automated emails, are not actually doing the response element. They're not containing the threat. They're not there to provide instant response. That might be an additional cost on top of the service, so that when the worst happens, and it's a when, not if, then you've got that full instant response support. One of the elements from our own SOC services that we're proud of is the fact that we provide that end-to-end piece. So we're there to detect and respond to lower level alerts as part of the SOC service, but then on top of that, we've got the instant response element that can support you 24/7 as well. So it's really key to make sure when you're buying your SOC service, you know and understand what you're getting. Is it just alert monitoring and notification? Are they going to do response and containment? Are they going to provide instant response as part of that piece as well? So another common gap that occurs within service providers, again, is that to emphasize that there's not the response option. So that may mean that analysts don't have the integration to be able to isolate compromised hosts, endpoints in your infrastructure. They can't isolate or disable or contain identities within your infrastructure, because you have to think about both. If you contain an endpoint and the identity is still compromised, the threat actor might be able to jump onto another endpoint or pivot to cloud and then continue their attack. And then finally, network containment for when the worst scenario does happen. If you have a ransomware attack or a major compromise, an Active Directory compromise, you have that ability to cut off the network in a manageable way and open up certain levels of access. And that's a really unique piece from our own SOC service. We can do all of those containment pieces as part of either our integration into your existing Microsoft Defender or CrowdStrike stack. And then we have that control of the Janet network, whereby we can put containment measures in place for customers within the infrastructure, so that, for example, if they do have a major cyber incident, we can draw the shutters down, stop the threat actor continuing to compromise the infrastructure, and, for example, steal more data while doing an orderly instant response process. And this has worked really effectively in a number of major incidents where we can kind of open up certain sections of the internet so that, for example, you can still access Microsoft Teams and Microsoft services, but not necessarily everything else, to try and provide that protection element. So again, key thing, differentiator, without that response, really what you're looking at is you're looking at a managed SIEM solution. So if a provider is just sending you alerts, telling you about the alerts that are going on, they're not giving you that full SOC service wrap. They're not giving you that full end-to-end support. And often the kind of the cheaper SOC services are in fact more managed SIEMs under the hood, and alerting you to threats, but not mitigating them or not doing proactive threat hunting or other elements of that nature. So coming back to the kind of core elements that you need to be thinking about when you're looking at SOC services. So as well as that kind of alert triage, investigation and response, does the service include threat hunting based on threat intelligence? So one of the key aspects that we're starting to identify now is that you need to find the gaps between where you don't have detections. And as the threat landscape is evolving, threat actors are becoming much cleverer at bypassing detections. Having proactive threat hunting is a really key aspect of that. And the NCSE is really pushing this as a key core capability that organizations have to have. So where threat hunting is different to detections, detections are predefined detection rules in Defender or rules that are built to then fire off an alert at the point at which it's detected that particular activity. As opposed to threat hunting, which can be structured or unstructured. Structured is where you do what's called an hypothesis-based investigation. You identify a potential weak point or area that either a threat actor is already compromised or has been publicly made aware of through threat intelligence data or data your threat intelligence provider has given, and they do a structured threat hunt to identify the tactics, techniques, and the IOCs to see whether or not the organization has been compromised. So this is a more proactive approach. Followed on by more unstructured threat hunting, which is equally as important, which could be, for example, where you found a customer has identified a compromise, or you've identified a compromise within an infrastructure, for example, phishing or other based other compromises, and you then proactively search for those IOCs across other customer bases to make them aware and or contain those incidents if they are truly not false positives in that regard. Detection, tuning, and reducing the false positives. So that's really key. You don't want to be sending, garbage to customers to customers around what data where the SOC is seeing. So that continuous false positive reduction is really, really important. Security hardening. So this is a really key differentiator. So one of the things we've noticed through our kind of onboarding journey with customers onto our own SOC service is that security tools are not often configured as they need to be. They're not turned, certain functionality, certain features are not turned on correctly. So what is really key during onboarding, especially, but also onward after onboarding, is supporting customers around that security hardening, making sure their Defender XDR is tuned correctly. It's got the right features turned on. The SOC can respond effectively based on those features. And one of the key things we've embedded into our own SOC service, which is really a value add, is that as part of that onboarding, there's a huge amount of additional consultancy time that we provide to make sure that your Defender is configured correctly, supporting customers with building that up and making sure that that is configured correctly. Their Active Directory, they've identified any issues within those areas. And also, as I was mentioning earlier on, looking at your external attack surface. So, looking at solutions like attack surface management to see whether or not external systems can be identified that might be exposed. That's again another key aspect you should be asking providers: is how are you improving the security posture or supporting the tuning of security tools within the customer environment. Instant response support. So this is a really key aspect, and Jisc is proud to be NCSE standard accredited for instant response and CREST accredited as well. You need that support if the worst does happen. So we integrate our two solutions together, our SOC and instant response, so that if the worst does happen and there is a major incident, and you need support, we've got our instant response team there and our digital forensics teams available as well. So combining those two and understanding if you get that support, because without instant response support, you've got a really big gap when the worst does happen. And then the last one is just continuous improvement, demonstrating, making sure the vendor is demonstrating that they've got improvement processes on their detection capabilities. They're building new detections. They're building detections based on threat intelligence, and making sure that there's that feedback loop more broadly there. Okay, that's it from me. I'll hand you over to Mark.
Cool. Thank you, Paul. So yeah, I'll be explaining a little bit more as to what identity threat detection and response is and why it's so important as part of a SOC offering. So identity threat detection and response basically picks up on attacks towards Active Directory and also branches out to cloud environments as well, like Entra ID. It's basically looking at attacks that mean the threat actor is trying to privilege escalate. They're trying to privilege escalate and laterally move across your infrastructure. Um, Privilege escalation and lateral movement is pretty much something we always see in every major incident engagement and is an essential part of any SOC offering, really, to be able to pick up on that activity and, more importantly, to be able to respond and actually block and contain it and isolate those identities when they see compromised accounts and identities. As Paul was saying earlier, unless you're able to contain those identities, you've not really got a well-rounded and sort of robust response capability from your SOC offering. To give a really sort of basic example of this, a threat actor could compromise something like a remote desktop gateway or a VPN account, and they could connect remotely to your infrastructure, and they could start to carry out things like a reconnaissance activity towards Active Directory to understand where and how they can privilege escalate and what assets they can laterally move to in order to compromise your entire infrastructure and your domain in order to leverage something like a ransomware attack against your environment and your IT infrastructure. And unless you've got detection rules and things that can pick up on that activity and you're actually able to respond and isolate in that window when that activity is taking place, ultimately that's potentially where you could fall short. So I think if we could flip to the next slide, please, Paul, I can detail this a little bit more. So this slide depicts some of the tactics, techniques, procedures, detections, and such activities that we see commonly observed during major incident engagement. So during full domain compromises, data exfiltration, ransomware type attacks. These are some of the common detections and activities that we see. The ones with asterisks against them, so bloodhound activity, Kerberos roasting activity, especially DC sync attacks, especially past the hash and past the ticket attacks, especially, are three of the most common privilege escalation techniques that we see observed. These will not be natively picked up by EDRs. Even if you have EDRs deployed on your domain controllers, for example, they will not pick up on this activity from assets and infrastructure elsewhere across your environment. You need an ITDR solution in order to pick up on this activity actually taking place. If this activity did take place on an endpoint, for example, that had EDRs installed, what would potentially be picked up on is the tools that the threat actor is using to orchestrate that activity. But the activity itself towards Active Directory won't be picked up on. And this is really important when you take into consideration, like what Paul was saying earlier, EDR killers. It's quite a well-known one. A very common way of doing this now is using bring your own vulnerable driver techniques. If they were to kill the EDR on a certain endpoint, for example, and then orchestrate privilege escalation or reconnaissance activity, your SOC would not see that activity without an ITDR solution installed on Active Directory. So basically the target of those privilege escalation attacks. The other sort of use case for this as well is shadow IT infrastructure. So assets and endpoints potentially that aren't onboarded to EDRs and antivirus. You'd like to think that doesn't happen, but pretty much in every major incident engagement the CSERT team has engaged with, we've always found gaps in EDR coverage across your IT infrastructure and estates. And really, this provides an extra layer of assurance that if something does happen on an endpoint that's either not onboarded onto EDR or that a threat actor has killed the EDR via an EDR killer tool, BYOV vulnerable drive, for example, then you've still got a means for picking up on this privilege escalation activity. And you've still got a means for, more importantly, responding to and containing the identities that are orchestrating that activity. So you're not allowing that threat to grow and basically, carry out further activity and present a further risk to your organization. I think we can probably go next slide there, please, Paul. So without an ITDR, as just mentioned there, SOC may completely miss some of the most dangerous stages of an attack. Those privilege escalation, those lateral movement stages of an attack are essentially your respond window before it gets to a full domain compromise. Generally, what we see after a full domain compromise takes place, so that they're able to achieve privilege escalation, compromising an enterprise admin or domain admin level accounts. Generally, the only couple of phases that usually take place after that are disrupting and destroying backups, exfiltrating data, and then dropping the ransomware payload to destroy your infrastructure, essentially. And that all happens quite quickly as soon as they reach that full domain compromise level. So again, without this ITDR solution, you could potentially miss that activity, and that could have been your only activity and window to respond against, especially if it's come from shadow IT infrastructure or infrastructure that's potentially not had EDR functioning correctly. And more importantly, it's not just the detection piece; it's the containment piece. So I mentioned earlier, if a threat actor connects via a VPN or RD gateway solution, for example, and they start carrying out reconnaissance, and your SOC can only contain the endpoints in that RD gateway cluster, and you might contain one of the hosts that sort of cluster diverts the user to. The threat actor can still essentially re-authenticate against your RD gateway, join another host within the cluster, for example, or can keep connecting to a VPN solution and keep carrying out reconnaissance activity. And your SOC's got no way to contain that activity until they actually reach endpoints elsewhere across your infrastructure, whereby they can contain those hosts, essentially. So this is really important to have the containment place, and the only reason, or the only way to get that containment capability in most SOC offerings is via using the ITDR solution. So it picks up on the activity, it detects it, but then it also allows your SOC to contain those identities as well. Next slide, please, Paul. So it's also important to highlight that not all ITDRs are equal. The Jisc SOC offering has chosen to support and work with both Microsoft Security Stack and with CrowdStrike Security Stacks, because they support both on-premise Active Directory as well as cloud environments like Entra ID, essentially. We are aware of other vendors that only support the Entra ID side of things at the moment, and essentially it just means that you've not got that same visibility, detect, and response capability against your on-prem Active Directory infrastructure. It's really important to make sure that ITDR solution supports both sides of your environment, essentially both cloud environments and the on-premise environments. Because more often than not, those major incidents, those ransomware attacks targeting sort of on-prem environments, those are more often than not the kind of the engagements that we deal with. But obviously, cloud environments are a huge target for threat actors as well, and you need the same visibility and response capability, whether it's on-premise or in cloud environments, in order to manage and respond to that risk effectively. And I think that might be everything for myself. It might be over to Steve now.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So now we're at the section around questions to consider when choosing or looking to deploy a SOC inside your environment. They're broken down into three very high level areas there, and I've got some pointers to guide you through when looking at those particular areas. So if we start on the first one there, what do the vendor's service level agreements actually cover? It's quite easy to be blindsided by some really exceptional looking SLAs that are quoted by some providers, i.e. 15-minute response time. What does that actually mean? And more importantly, is there actually any benefit in those times quoted? So does the SLA simply mean a response within that time, or does it actually include some form of mitigation and response action to actually contain the threat? That's really the kind of SLAs you're looking for, not just an automated response to say an alert has been triggered and the provider is looking at them. Also important is how quickly are you as a customer notified of a high priority or critical incident? What are the criteria for notifying the customer? I mean, that's really important to understand. Should you receive a call, is it something you should take seriously, or can you be confident that your SOC provider has it all covered and in hand? Also around SLAs, what happens if the SOC provider's monitoring tools or sensors or any integrations deployed fail? Who's responsible for monitoring those? Who's responsible for ensuring that they maintain a respectable uptime to ensure the SOC is providing adequate coverage? That's something that's quite often overlooked, and there's a dangerous area of assumption sometimes where each party assumes the other is looking after that. Clearly, that sort of thing is really key, because you don't want a SOC that can't actually see or is unaware that they're unable to see a key part of your environment. Another thing around SLAs are reporting and service reviews included as part of the agreement, or are they a chargeable add-on? SOCs are big ticket items, and it's really important to, not just for customers to be able to present upwards, even to board level, to demonstrate the value of the SOC and what are they actually getting for their money, but also to demonstrate things like improvements over time, as Paul already alluded to. Those constant detection rules tuning, the reduction of false positives over time. It's really important that the SOC provider articulates that to the customer so they can demonstrate the value and the increase in their security posture. Another part around the SLAs can be lies, a bit like statistics, really. It's possible, depending on how a contract is worded, that a provider could be meeting all SLAs whilst an attacker remains active in your environment. It really depends on what those SLAs are aligned to. So it's really important to focus on the outcomes, not just the quoted response times around SLAs. A challenge for people on the call today really is, if your SOC detects ransomware at 2 o'clock tomorrow morning, what is your provider obliged to do next? The next two questions I'm going to join together, because essentially that they can be broken down into the same sort of areas of questions you should be asking. What happens next after an attack is detected, and the contractual obligations around that? So key things to consider, such things as, does the provider investigate, contain and respond, or simply escalate it to yourselves? Detection is only the start of an attack. What happens next? Do you know what should happen next? Do you know what your provider actions your provider can take on your behalf without getting in touch with you? Ransomware threat actors operate outside business hours. They want to break in when everyone's asleep. You need to have the confidence, if your SOC provider knows what actions they are permitted to take if they cannot contact anyone at your organization and have signs of compromise. Is incident response available 24/7, or is it only during business hours? It's really important to check the contractual terms of any SOC agreement in terms of that incident response piece. Also, who would lead the incident? If a major incident was declared, who would actually lead that incident? Would it be your SOC provider, or would it be your team inside your organization? If we move slightly sideways and talk about costs, what support is included in the cost of the service? Is anything a chargeable extra? It's easy to assume that a SOC provider will take care of everything for that fee you're paying monthly or annually. But it's really important that you check the fine print to understand what's included and what may potentially be charged for in the event of an incident. Such things as incident response, I've already mentioned, digital forensics. How did the attacker, the post-mortem afterwards? Out of our support. It's quite easy to promote 24/7, but what does that actually entail? Is that full 24/7? Also around recovery assistance. So an attack has happened, ransomware has been deployed. Does your SOC provider leave it there, or will they assist you with your business continuity, disaster recovery process to get your business back up and running as quickly as possible. And also, once the major incident has been closed down, will they provide an executive summary for you to send up to your ELT/SLT? It's really important that you review these potential costs before an incident occurs, because no one wants unexpected surprises in terms of that financial burden. A true SOC helps you navigate an attack, not just notify you that one is happening. And around the budget, just to really reiterate that last point, some providers include incident response, others don't. Have you budgeted for when an attack occurs? Because if it's not included in the SOC contract, you can expect a really sizable charge to move forward with that with your provider. Next slide, please, Paul. And just breaking it down into these 6 key questions. There was a lot of detail previously. They can be broken down into these ones. Does the SOC investigate and validate alerts or simply forward them? Essentially, is incident response included? Are mitigations included in the SOC service, or will they simply let you know that someone's broken in? Can analysts contain threats directly? That goes back to the EDR and the ITDR that Paul and Mark were both talking about. Can they actually mitigate the threat on your behalf without having to get you involved? Also, does the service perform security hardening and tuning? It's really, really important, and we've learned that developing our SOC, to essentially know that you as a customer are operating really within best practice parameters for the tooling that you have deployed. It's really easy to just deploy an MSI or equivalent across your infrastructure and think it's deployed across all endpoints, therefore job done. That's only where the journey begins. It's really important to make sure that they are really configured for best practice, not only to ensure that threats are detected correctly, but also to make sure that you don't go the other way and you're just inundated with false positives. And finally, just to really, really reiterate the last point I'm going to mention here, does ITDR solution include Active Directory protection? 10 years ago, attackers targeted machines, and today they're targeting identities. If the SOC can see endpoints but can't see identity abuse, you're missing one of the most common paths to compromise. And that's me done. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much, Mark. So we're now at the end. We'll kind of pick up any of the questions in the chat. I can see we've got one in here from Harry, which is, I was wondering about measures to prevent, detect token theft, e.g. man in the middle or adversary in the middle. These attacks are lethal as it bypasses MFA, and these attacks have been happening. So that's part 1 of the question. Mark, did you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I can jump in here with some guidance. Yeah, one of the most effective ways or the most convenient ways for preventing compromise off the back of these kind of attacks is to implement conditional access policies for user risk, sign-in risk, and also for information registration lockdown. I would say the most effective one is sign-in risk. And when you implement sign-in risk policies, to try and configure the thresholds as high and medium if you can do, but more importantly, to set the policy to block as opposed to require MFA. There's a few blogs out there that says why it can be quite dangerous to just have it require MFA. Essentially, if the threat actor manages to sort of bypass that policy, then not only do they compromise the account, but because it's required MFA that the threat actor's honoured by compromising those hijack sessions, essentially, then it clears the risk score associated with the user. So the sign-in risk one is by far one of the most effective policies that you can put in place The user risk one is also a really good policy to put in place. That looks a little bit more holistically than just the individual sign-in session. And I would say having that triggers, again, under sort of high and medium thresholds, if you can do, and just having that to require MFA and potentially with password resets as well is good enough. And then the third and final one is to implement a CA policy that surrounds information registration lockdown, so that the security information surrounding multi-factor authentication actually controlling where your users can register that information. If you can lock that down to just campus IP addresses and networks and infrastructure, then it means that threat actors can't compromise those accounts and then register their own MFA tokens and such and OTP devices from overseas. It has to come from your on-premise network. The other thing that's really important to sort of review as part of strengthening your defenses against this is actually email filtering controls. So making sure you've got the basics in place, things like SPF, DKIM, DMARC, if you can do, anti-spam and anti-phishing policies. We've come across quite often in engagements. We see things like having certain domains ACL'd allowed, including organizations' own domains. That's quite a big issue, to be completely honest. It doesn't only bypass your anti-spam controls, but having your own domain in there also bypasses all of your anti-phishing controls. So just sanity checking and health checking that all those bells and whistles turned on for your mail filtering, your anti-phishing controls are actually there and where they should be and configured to best standards and best practice, and you've turned everything on that's been released recently. And then I'd say that the gold standard for preventing compromise of these kind of attacks is 502. So the likes of YubiKeys and such, those physical MFA tokens. But obviously there is quite a lot of work involved in managing and deploying and maintaining that. But that is the ultimate golden standard for pretty much stopping these kind of compromises straight at the door, pretty much. Yeah, I don't know if you'd add anything to that, Paul.
Yeah, no, the only thing I'd say, well, yeah, agree with all of that. The only other thing just to add or just to emphasize really is, again, going back to the kind of SOC piece is that threat hunting element, being able to then also threat hunt and identify some of those IOCs that may have slipped through detections, identifying more organizations and having that kind of cross-organization searching capability is really, really important. You may not your detections may not pick up everything, or your SOC may not, but it should then be complemented by that structured and unstructured threat hunting. So SOCs where they've identified an adversary in the middle compromise here can then use the IOCs, domain names, IPs, etc., to then search across their other customer base and then make sure that they identify those. It's not just adversary in the middle. Obviously, we've also seen things like device code, which has been a big issue more broadly. So, as Mark was saying, it's about detection, but also putting in the right mitigations, and the right mitigations can also help with the detections. So that's a really key point. The second part of that question, which is mitigation into for students using personal devices, BYOD doesn't seem to be available. Yeah, BYOD generally across any piece is a difficult element to manage. I think what SOC providers need to make sure they do is, again, have that identity detection, that identity visibility, to make sure that if, for example, a student is compromised on their own BYOD device and it's their student identity that's owned by the organization, then you've got those mitigations and those detections in the background if they decide to try and log into M365 or any or VPN services, etc., and pick up that malicious activity. So I think it's a mix of both. So if you're, for example, a Defender house, having a Defender for Office 365 is really beneficial as well, because it provides that kind of expanded detection piece, which is really, really important. Question number 2 from Borders College was, do you ask your clients to inform you before they conduct a pen test? So yes, as standard, if it's a generalized pen test, we absolutely ask our customers any simulated testing that occurs in that sort of scenario. We like to know about it because it can be very, very noisy. But also equally, if you've got lots of noise in a SOC that's being set up by a pen tester, you could miss actual real threats that might be occurring at the same time. But certainly in terms of structured red teaming as well, we performed an initial red teaming engagement when we first developed our SOC to help identify and either gaps in detections, etc. So we're always keen to work with our customers around if they want to do a, for example, red team engagement, work with us if they want to test our response. We're more than happy to support that. What I would also add is from our own SOC provider, SOC perspective, when we actually onboard customers, we actually do our own kind of automated simulated atomic red team testing as part of that go live process to basically run a simulated threat actor, a ransomware attack, for example, with those initial TTPs to kind of demonstrate that they're being detected by the tooling, the SOC's responding, and we're containing them appropriately to respond and make sure we can demonstrate that response. Tom Benham has asked a question around Sophos. So yes, that's correct. At the moment, we don't support Sophos as a provider, but we are working with Sophos around how we might be able to do that in the future. In terms of CrowdStrike and Defender licensing, I would 100% point you towards our chess team, the chess website, as we've managed to negotiate some pretty good deals with CrowdStrike and Defender for the licensing side of things. And my colleague Paul has just posted the chess link in the chat for everybody. So I'm just trying to check if I've missed anything. I don't think so. I think my colleagues have answered a few more of those. Just one of Harshad, I think mentioned, and my colleague Paul has mentioned in the chat, but just to expand on that question of does Jisc offering include such things such as ITDR, or is that a modular approach? So as part of our SOC model, we employ what we kind of call a bring your own device scenario. So we advise you what components you need if you're using the Defender stack, CrowdStrike, or a mix. Some of our customers are quite keen on the CrowdStrike EDR, but they might want to have the identity protection from Defender. They work very well together, and you can mix and match them. So we require certain requirements as part of the onboarding process, and that covers the ITDR. So if you're a Defender house, a Microsoft Defender XDR, it's Defender for Identity, so you need an A5 or A5 security license for that. If it's CrowdStrike, you've got the CrowdStrike identity component, or as I say, you can mix the two. So we also do support a kind of hybrid approach to the deployment of CrowdStrike and Defender XDR at the moment. Had another question from Steve. Are there any plans to tie in with the Bitdefender? So I'll be honest, at the moment, that's not on our direct roadmap, but I believe we are having some conversations with Bitdefender and other providers as well. The key element for us across all of these pieces, as we've already identified earlier, is that we want to make sure those tech stacks from an EDR, XDR perspective cover those key components, and those are making sure that you've got the solution supports our identity protection, both on-premise and Active Directory on-prem, cloud-based ITDR as well. The provider supports host containment and isolation and identity containment isolation. So those are the kind of key criteria that we're looking towards. But yeah, certainly we'll update as and when we've started having conversations with those additional vendors. Okay, so yeah, another Bitdefender. So again, in terms of those key elements, if you are interested in kind of having conversations separately offline, then more than happy to share what is supported and what is not. We broadly use Splunk as our ingest for our SIEM solution for our detection rules. So we can look at other log sources, etc., around other solutions, and we're always willing to look at those as part of an onboarding process as well. Ryan's mentioned about SOC analyst to customer ratio. So I don't know that off the top of my head, but I can certainly we can take that question away from for you. But what we do ensure is that both in hours and in especially out of hours, that we've got response capability to respond to threats. So one of the key elements that we've tried to differentiate from a much more on is we feel the response is a really important aspect of a SOC. So out of hours, we want to make sure that the response is as good as it can be. So we make sure that basically our level twos and our incident response leads are available during those out of hours periods, so they can respond, mitigate, and then if it escalates, deal with that in one piece essentially. There's one other question outside core hours. So I will need to double check the SLAs offline on that, but we'll post a message response from the team on that one, Chris. Response times for CSET team to automated alerts. The other key thing is on those automated alerts, it's not just the responding to them, it's the containing and mitigating them at the same time. I'll hold fire for another minute to see if there are any other questions. Obviously, if you have any follow-ups or any questions, please feel free to email through any follow-up questions that you've got. And if you do drop any more in here, we'll try and pick them up offline as well. Okay, unless there are any other questions, it's 23 minutes past, so I think we'll leave it at that and say thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. Hopefully you found that beneficial. And again, if you've got any further follow-up conversations or that you want to reach out and talk to us about, please do get in touch. Brilliant. Thank you very much, all.